All right. Thanks for your patience, folks. We've got a great crowd on the phone today, so hopefully you all enjoy this webinar. We are going to be covering Farm Bill conservation programs, collaboration between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So the Farm Bill, as many of you already know, is the single largest source of land conservation in the country. So understanding the various programs offered through USDA's Farm Service Agency, as well as the Natural Resources Conservation Service, can maximize fish and wildlife benefits. So today's webinar will be recorded and posted online on Restore America's Estuaries YouTube channel. It'll be posted early next week. And a link to that recording will also be sent out to all of the registrants. All attendees have been placed in listen-only mode, and we'll be using the question box in the side panel down at the the bottom half of that side panel to ask any questions. So don't try to use your telephone or raise your hand through the panel. Just type any questions you have in the questions box, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. So just so you all can put a face with the folks on the phone today, I'm Lee Habegger, and I'm the External Affairs Manager for Restore America's Estuaries. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Our presenter is Ed Christopher, a Fish and Wildlife Service Farm Conservation Programs biologist. He's been with the Fish and Wildlife Service for 7 years and has worked on the Farm Bill conservation programs there for about 2 years, but prior to that he worked on Farm Bill conservation programs for over a decade with the North Carolina Forest Service. We're thrilled to have him on the webinar today. He is a wealth of information, and so he will hopefully be able to offer some insights on ways that we can fully utilize the available Farm Bill conservation programs. So before we dive into the Farm Bill's conservation program, just want to provide a little bit of background on Restore America's Estuaries if anybody is not familiar with us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit that leads a national alliance of 10 community-based organizations dedicated to the protection and restoration of bays and estuaries as essential resources for our nation. We also provide a unified voice at the nation's capital to further prioritize these important habitats. So you can check out more at our website down at the bottom of that screen there, www.estuaries.org. And a quick plug about our 2018 National Summit. We'll be hosting the 9th Annual National Summit in December 2018 out in Long Beach, California. And we are partnering with the Coastal States Organization this year. We're very excited about that. These biennial summits are one of the largest gatherings of coastal and restoration scientists, practitioners, policy analysts, and managers. You can check out more information again on our website, www.estuaries.org/summit, or feel free to contact me if you have any questions. My email will be at the end of this presentation. So now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ed and let him tell you all a little bit more about himself and start in on the presentation. But again, one quick reminder, we'll be using the questions box in your side panel to submit any questions. We'll cover as many questions as time allows at the end of the presentation. Please don't try to unmute yourself on the telephone or raise your hand within the GoToWebinar platform. Just simply type your question into the question box, and I'll keep a running list and pass those along to Ed so he can answer them at the end of the presentation. All right, so now we are all set to turn things over to Ed. So I will pass the controls over to him. Ed, if you want to unmute yourself and then dive on in.
All right. Hey, I don't know if everybody can hear me, but good day to you. Yes, my name's Ed Christopher, and I'm here with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Wildlife Refuge System located in our headquarters office in Falls Church, Virginia. And I'm excited to talk with everybody today about the various programs offered by USDA's farm conservation programs, as well as how it is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partners with USDA in maximizing conservation benefits offered by the various programs themselves. And as for anything else to add about myself, Lee, thank you, you did a fantastic job. So with that being said, let's get started. So the Farm Bill, the 2014 Farm Bill is very much like a Swiss Army knife, as it says here in this slide. And out of all the various functions that the Farm Bill offers, the one that we're most concerned about and interested in for our purposes today is the conservation title, Title II of the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill is considered one of the most important tools enacted by Congress for conserving habitat on private lands. And they put the conservation, I would say, in four main areas, which are considered working lands programs, the conservation reserve program, conservation easements, and partnerships. And so these programs are really designed to protect agriculture lands, so working lands across the United States, but also the efforts there to protect at-risk species on the working lands and to provide technical advice to private landowners so they can enact these practices to not only protect their livelihood, but also the species that reside on their property. So on February 7th in 2014, the latest rendition of the Farm Bill was enacted by Congress to benefit agricultural producers and the environment. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really targeted for private lands, and private lands make up almost 70% in the contiguous United States. And out of that, roughly 900 million acres are in production and farm in our ranch lands. And 300 million acres of that are roughly made up in non-industrial private forest land, primarily in the southeastern part of the United States. So why is it that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is interested, and should we all be interested in USDA Farm Bill? And it has to do with the allocation. It is by far the largest game in town when it comes to private lands conservation for North America. It has allocated $28 billion through the life of the Farm Bill through 2018. And so for a comparison, I'll just show you here, last year's dollars was $5.3 billion for conservation. So compare that to other U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service programs in the service here, and what you'll see is the Farm Bill by far outweighs any sort of dollars that could be offered up for private landowners through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The highest amount there, as you'll see on the graph, is the Pittman-Robertson dollars, which is barely $850 million. That's still a significant amount of money, but looking at the graph, you could see the $5.3 billion for just 1 year out of the life of the 2014 Farm Bill is substantially more. So what is it that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does with respect to farm conservation programs? So it's just myself. As Lee mentioned, I'm the conservation biologist, and then I have my supervisor who's the farm conservation coordinator. So it's just the two of us that our full-time job is to pay attention to USDA's farm conservation programs and how it is that we can maximize the benefit across the landscape. So part of our job is really to disseminate information on implementation of the programs to service field staff so they themselves can identify opportunities really to enhance fish and wildlife conservation goals, but using the USDA programs to reach their goals and objectives. Also, we provide technical assistance to USDA not only at the local and state level, but also here at the national level to enhance fish and wildlife benefits for Farm Bill conservation programs and initiatives. And really good examples of that, and we'll talk about it more, is Working Lands for Wildlife program, for those of you that are familiar with that, and then also the ongoing monarch conservation effort that's taking place in the central part of the country, but also in Canada and Mexico. And another aspect of what it is we do is that we coordinate service review and comment on USDA rules and policies and program changes for the Farm Bill. So we're getting ready to come up with the 2018 reauthorization of the Farm Bill, and so we're putting together a work group and identifying areas where we can improve conservation benefits offered through the myriad of programs that we'll discuss here shortly. And last but not least, we build and enhance conservation collaboration among our partners, and that's a big part of what we're doing here today. In the Fish and Wildlife Service, you're typically used to hearing about the refuge system or fish hatcheries or consultation for endangered species. But if you're not aware, the Fish and Wildlife Service does have a private lands program, programs, I should say. The two of them are the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program and also the Coastal program. And what these two programs do, they provide technical and financial assistance to landowners, including ag producers, to help them access resources available through the Farm Bill, as well as their own in particular programs that can be partnered with Farm Bill programs to maximize the conservation benefit on the people's property. And here is a shameless plug. We've recently developed a Farm Bill Conservation Programs brochure, and most everything of what it is that we'll be discussing today on this webinar can be found in this Farm Conservation Programs brochure. And the idea here is for when the Partners and Coastal Program biologists are out there with the landowners, or our partners are out there discussing ways to conserve wetlands, lands, you name it. They have this in their back pocket that they could share with landowners and discuss maybe the programs that would be the best fit for them, and which they too can then partner with and enhance, again, that large-scale conservation effort. So with that, we'll dive a little bit into the Farm Bill program now, and then the programs themselves. So there are two general types of voluntary conservation program buckets that I say offered through the Farm Bill, and one is the Working Lands program, and two are the easement programs. And then there are two primary essential agencies in USDA that administer these programs, one being the Farm Service Agency, so FSA, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. So as we go through this, I just want to apologize in advance the alphabet soup that will occur with all the acronyms from the various programs. So FSA and NRCS is just the tip of the iceberg. So here's a visual of how that looks in the buckets of the Farm Bill. This isn't every single program offered, but these are the primary ones. And I'll touch also on the Healthy Forest Reserve program that's falling under that bottom one underneath NRCS, which is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. But as you see here, the bulk of the programs fall underneath NRCS, but the FSA program, the Conservation Reserve Program, is a juggernaut across this country, and so it has the primary program itself, but there are also other aspects of it. And a new one in the 2014 Farm Bill is the Conservation Reserve Program's Grasslands Initiative, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. So we'll start out with FSA and FSA's Conservation Reserve Program. This program is authorized budget of $1.9 billion. Again, there's the B word for billion. And its goal is to retire, these marginal agricultural lands to restore vegetation that improves soil by reducing erosion, and by doing so improves the air quality as well as the surface water quality, and improves the habitat wildlife quality as well. And part of what it is that the CRP does is you plant and maintain long-term resource covers to hedge against soil loss through erosion, especially along steep slopes next to stream banks, but also again on those marginal croplands as well. to be eligible to enroll in the Conservation Reserve Program, you need to have owned and operated the land for at least 12 months prior to the application. And once you are enrolled, the land is enrolled for up to 10 to 15 years. There is no minimum acreage as it indicates there. The only acreage limitation found in the 2014 Farm Bill is the 24 million acre cap on CRP enrollment. And this was new with this latest Farm Bill. And previously, in previous Farm Bills, the cap was much higher. At one point, it was close to 38 million acres was the allowable enrollment for CRP. But through this Farm Bill, the cap has been stepped down and is now, as of this year, a 24 million acre cap. So how do you enroll into the program? There's periodic application announcements known as general sign-up. And the general sign-up process is a competitive process. So you would be possibly competing with your neighbors down the road to become enrolled into the program. And the application process hedges significantly on EBI. So there's another acronym. And what that stands for is the Environmental Benefits Index. So there are several of these EBIs, and I'll just list a few of them. So they look at a score, for example, the wildlife factor score. They look at the water quality benefits from reduced erosion, runoff, and leaching point source. So that's on a scale from 1 to 100. Obviously, the higher number you receive from these EBIs, the greater chance that you will get to be enrolled. Another example of an EBI factor is the air quality benefits from reduced wind erosion as well. So they rank them, and those with the highest rank are the ones that are typically approved. Also, in talking with the Natural Resources Conservation Service and FSA folks, they also look at if the landowner, the producer, is already showing good faith in putting and installing conservation practices on their land. They look at that as also a factor that they consider when considering enrolling and accepting an application. Other enrollment types are continuous sign-up for certain approved conservation practices. An example for that is what is known as CP42, which is the Pollinator Habitat Initiative, or State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement, known as SAFE. But in certain states, there's also a targeted effort called the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP. And these are targeted to watersheds that are needing extra help, is the best way to put it, from primarily soil erosion and runoff from agricultural lands. And so that is on a continuous basis that landowners can sign up for CREP. So earlier I mentioned the CRP grasslands piece underneath the Conservation Reserve Program, which is new to the 2014 Farm Bill. And what this is it's a working lands aspect of the CRP, which is typically a land retirement program. And what it targets is environmentally sensitive agricultural lands. And like some aspects of CRP, the CRP grasslands is a continuous sign-up, but it's only accepted in batches and then ranked. So there's periodic announcements by the Farm Service Agency for a sign-up period for CRP grasslands. And once that sign-up period's closed, they take the applications and they send them to the national office for ranking and allocation of acres throughout the country. The contract, if approved, is between 14 to 15 years. And one of the key pieces to CRP grasslands is that the land must be currently covered in grass. And similar to the overarching CRP, CRP grasslands has a 2 million acre cap to it, so only a maximum of 2 million acres can be enrolled in CRP grasslands underneath the 2014 Farm Bill. So, and that 2 million acre cap is actually part of the 24 million acre cap for the overall CRP program. So just to give you an example of where we are on a national scale with with CRP. As of June, there was 23.5 million acres enrolled in CRP, and out of that, there's roughly 2 million acres that are going to be expiring. In other words, their contracts are going to be coming to a conclusion, and they are going to be coming out of CRP on October 1st, so next week. However, there are already approximately 2 million acres already signed up and ready to go at the start of the new year, and 800,000 acres of those will be in CRP grasslands, and roughly 900,000 acres will fall back into the CRP program. And primarily these are applications that were deferred from this past year. So from fiscal year 17, they enrolled, and the enrollment cap was already being reached. So what they did was defer these applicants to move to the fiscal year 18. So they kind of have a first come, first served basis for the start of this fiscal year. So that was the breadth of the FSA participation with Farm Bill conservation programs for this presentation. The next piece I want to cover is the NRCS conservation programs. And similar as what we talked about earlier, there's the working lands piece of it, the easements, and then there's a combination program that you see there at the bottom. So we have the Environmental Quality Incentives Program there at the top, EQIP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and then from the easement side of it, we have the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, and that falls into two pieces, which we'll talk about here, which is the agricultural component as well as the wetland component. And then there's the Healthy Forest Reserve Program that I mentioned earlier. This program currently does not have any dedicated funding to it. The funding that it does receive comes from the program that's right below that in the combination program, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So again, there's the litany of alphabet soup acronyms for you. So the primary program that most people think about when it comes to NRCS and conservation programs is EQIP, and it has an authorized budget of $1.65 billion annually. However, please note that does not mean that 1.65 goes 100% to what you would consider like conservation practices in the form of, let's say, prescribed fire or tree thinning or brush management. The majority of the dollars here go to agricultural feeding operations, lagoons, things of that nature, but roughly 5%, maybe a little more, goes to the conservation practices that I previously mentioned. So still a significant chunk of change on an annual basis, roughly around $83 million. And so what this program does is that it provides technical and financial assistance to those eligible producers, really to provide an incentive to help offset the cost of the conservation practices that are being employed on their property. And what NRCS does is that they'll create a conservation activity plan to address the various land uses that wish to be addressed by that landowner. And sometimes this can be done by NRCS district conservationists or soil conservationists, but also they can hire a technical service provider that is an expert in that field and is listed on their website, that can be selected by the landowner to come out there and perform a management plan for them to follow. And the goal of the program really is, from the conservation side of it, is really to enhance wildlife habitat on these working lands and forests. The tribal, agricultural producers and private non-industrial private forest landowners are eligible to apply for EQIP. And if they are accepted, the agreement duration can be up to 10 years. Unlike CRP, where there's the general sign-up and it comes in batches. For example, with CRP grasslands, the EQIP, the enrollment process is ongoing. There's no minimum acreage associated with what can and can't be enrolled into the program. And payments are made on for completed practices or activities identified in that contract, but they need to meet the NRCS standard. So if a practice is implemented on the property, then the NRCS representative will go out there to A, ensure that it was implemented, and B, ensure that it was implemented to the standards set forth in the conservation plan. And the payment rates for each of these practices are set each fiscal year, and they vary by state and by conservation practices. There's state technical committees that are in each of the 50 states and territories that work together to identify conservation practices that could be used for strategically targeting, whether it be soil erosion, wildlife habitat, water quality, and from that they take information from the previous years to come up with what is a satisfactory payment rate for somebody to employ these practices. So the other Working Lands program is the Conservation Stewardship Program. And this is the largest conservation program out of all the ones discussed today because it has over 70 million acres that are enrolled nationwide. And on an annual basis, there is a 10 million acre cap onto what new acres can be enrolled into the program. And the goal here for CSP is really to address the priority resource concerns as we've been discussing: soil, water, air quality, and wildlife. And unlike the other programs, the employed practices for the landscape and for that producer, they need to improve upon existing conservation practices and undertake additional conservation enhancement activities. And so you'll note that I italicize enhancement. So if you're not familiar with it, there's several categories of enhancement activities, and they are air quality, animal enhancements such as wildlife and non-wildlife, energy, plants such as pollinator and or beneficial insect habitat, soil erosion, soil quality, water quality, and water enhancements as well. So if there is a producer or landowner out there that is employing good practices already on the land and they are willing to take it to the next level is the best way to say it, then CSP is a good program to consider because as you can see there, it covers a myriad of land types and also a myriad of applicable eligibility for landowners, so tribal ag producers and non-industrial forest landowners. But the big thing for them, for those that are trying to enroll into this program, that they need to be in compliance with the highly erodible land and wetland conservation and have current farm records on file with their local county FSA office. And there's no minimal acreage for those that are going to be enrolling into this program, but the entire operation must be enrolled. So it's a holistic operation. It's whole farm, if you want to put it that way. So it might be that you're trying to address erosion on one side of the property, but those practices, if applicable elsewhere, are applied throughout the farm where applicable. And for those that sign up for it, it's a 5-year contract, and landowners can re-enroll if they're willing to adopt additional conservation activities. And so there's periodic enrollment announcements. It's not on a continuous basis, so it's on a periodic basis that landowners, interested producers can enroll into the CSP program. And once enrolled, payments are made to the landowner to maintain existing conservation based on operation type, the number of resources concerned that have been addressed. So, the more that you address, for example, if conservation enhancement activities are bundled, let's say from a pasture grazing bundle or a forest bundle, the more that landowner is willing to accept and take on from the conservation lens, they have the potential for a higher payment. And if they do that, the payments to implement the additional conservation activities are recognized. A person or a legal entity may not receive more than $40,000 annually through CSP or $200,000 over the life of the 5-year contract. So we're moving a little bit from the working land side and going over into the easement piece of this NRCS's buckets, and that is the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, or ACEP. And so this is a new program in the 2014 Farm Bill, and what this program did is that it replaces WRP, the Wetland Reserve Program, the Grassland Reserve Program, GRP, and the Farm Ranch Protection Program, FRPP. So it bundles those, and they are housed underneath ACEP. There's $500 million that are authorized for funding for this program. And as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, there's 2 easement buckets underneath ACEP. That's WRE and also the Agricultural Land Easements one, which is known as ALE. So applicant eligibility for WRE, it's Indian tribes, landowners, and ag producers. And for ALE, it's Indian tribes, ag producers, and non-industrial private forest owners, or NIPF, if you have heard that acronym before. So what are the separate goals for each of these easement programs housed underneath ACEP? So for WRE, it is to restore, protect, enhance farmed and converted or degraded wetlands, whereas for ALE, it's to prevent conversion of working cropland, grasslands, pasture lands, rangelands, and there's the non-industrial private forest land, so NIPF. So for the payments for the producers, the WRE, there's 50 to 100% of the restoration cost and easement value, depending upon that contract duration. And for ALE, it's up to 75% of that easement value. So we talked there about the contract duration. So for WRE, you can have it for 30 years or a permanent easement, or a 30-year contract for tribes, whereas for ALE, you have a permanent easement or a maximum duration for allowable underneath state law for that easement to exist. And enrollment into ACEP is ongoing, and it's reviewed and ranked in batches, similar to what we were talking about earlier with CRP grasslands. So the last one here, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, is a unique, again, to the 2014 Farm Bill, and the goal here is really to promote collaboration among NRCS, producers, landowners, and other partners, and really cobble together the financial might and will of various entities to make broad landscape conservation actions for the benefit of whether it's a critical habitat like the Chesapeake Bay for that benefit, or for a species, or for a watershed. And so how this works is that RCPP leverages non-federal funds and its goals of at least 1-to-1, and it's provided approximately $1.2 billion for the life of this Farm Bill. So roughly every fiscal year, it has announcements for about $250 million available for those that can enroll into the RCPP program. And the application process, you look at 3 buckets. One is at the national level, is what it is this project doing. Is this at a national level? Is it at a state level, state specific? So is it only for Iowa? Is this only for Virginia, et cetera? Or is it for a critical conservation area? And what that means is these are areas that have been identified by the Secretary of Agriculture, and I think in the 2014 Farm Bill there were 8 critical conservation areas that have targeted efforts for the restoration and enhancement of these locations. And I mentioned one earlier, the example being the Chesapeake Bay. So who can put in a proposal for RCPP? Well, tribal governments, states, and local governments, agriculture and forest associations, water districts, non-government organizations, and educational institutions. Note that I didn't identify a private landowner. Private landowners can benefit and participate by other means into the umbrella RCPP project in their area, but they're not part of the eligible applicant pool. And requests for proposals are announced periodically, as I mentioned, and those entities that submit their proposals, these are considered pre-proposals. And so these pre-proposals are reviewed at the national level, and if they are found to be providing the greatest benefit and bringing the most partners to the table to get the greatest accomplishments on the ground, then typically NRCS will respond to the primary applicant with a request for a full proposal. And at that point in time, that's where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service can also come in and help, because we can be your partner in these proposals. We could be listed as a contributor. We can provide an overall contribution to the conservation effort as in your in the project. However, it's not a federal dollar for dollar match, but rather again, it's a contribution that the Fish and Wildlife Service is providing to meet that overall RCPP goal and its objectives. So what are some of the land types covered from for this? There's the cropland, grassland, pasture land, and rangeland in the NIPF, much like others. And the next program here is the Healthy Forest Reserve Program, one that I didn't mention because it has no dedicated funding, but I find it important just to be aware of because there is interest in it, possibly for resurrecting it in the 2018 Farm Bill. That, and I'm a forester by trade, so it's hard to delete this one. So the goal of HFRP is to enhance and protect non-industrial forest land through either the purchase of easements and other financial assistance to the landowner. It's available to tribes and non-industrial private forest land, and the way that the payments go out is 50 to 100% of the restoration costs can be covered through the easement, or 75% to 100% of easement value depending upon that contract's duration. And so typically a 10-year restoration agreement or a 30-year or potential permanent easement for certain conservation actions, and as you can see there, with an additional 30-year contract for the tribes. So HFRP is only funded, as I mentioned, out of RCPP for now, but again, there's been conversations where the interest in that program has been discussed with our partners that we've been having these conversations with, and so I wouldn't be surprised if HFRP came back with some dedicated funding, but I guess time will tell. We'll be wait and see. So how is it that you can apply for these programs? Well, if you visit this URL link, it'll take you to this below screenshot that you see here, the United States. And if you just click on that state, it'll list the FSA and NRCS offices that are local to you, and then it's as simple as picking up the phone or just walking into the office and having that conversation with your local FSA or NRCS official, and just being put on a list for them to come out and visit your property and meet with you out there and discuss ways with which their conservation programs can be a benefit to you. So those were the NRCS and FSA conservation programs. What I want to talk a little bit more about now is how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NRCS and FSA work together through collaborative conservation to benefit wildlife and fish and wildlife and their habitats. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, I talked about the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program and the coastal programs. These two distinct programs provide conservation practices or easements where landowners might not meet NRCS eligibility, or can enhance and expand conservation benefits offered by NRCS and or FSA, I should have put there, their programs. And a good example of that was I visited a site in West Virginia where the State Forestry Agency was planting trees in the riparian zone. It was Conservation Reserve Program pasture land. They were retiring the land above it, and the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program was installing fence to keep the cows out of the stream and out of the area where the trees were being planted. So just a way to cobble together the various programs, again, to benefit the producer, but also the big benefit there is for the trout stream, and then those that are, enjoy the good trout fishery downstream as well. And this is really driven strategically at the local level. As I mentioned earlier, we talk at the national level with program leads with NRCS and FSA from my office, but where the rubber meets the road really is at the local level. So the conversations, the meaningful conversations down there really set the tone for what it is that we need to pursue and how it is we need to pursue it to address needs that we see in Farm Bill conservation programs. And part of that conversation is happening, as I talked about earlier, with the 2018 reauthorization. Another way with which the Fish and Wildlife Service collaborates with USDA is that we provide regulatory predictability for species in decline or species listed as threatened and endangered. And a primary mechanism is through the Working Lands for Wildlife program, which I'll talk about here in a second. But also another example is providing consultation to FSA for the Gunnison sage grouse and identifying conservation practices that would be beneficial for the producer and beneficial for the bird. Another one was for lesser prairie chicken, greater sage grouse, and the list goes on because we really do look at USDA as our partners in conservation, and I know it's the same way that they look at us. So what is the Working Lands for Wildlife program? For those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's a NRCS, I wouldn't even say program, and I wouldn't even say initiative. It's just an NRCS means how to help producers sustain their agricultural, ranching, and forestry operations while still conserving and protecting at-risk species. And as I mentioned earlier, we provide that regulatory predictability that can last up to 30 years through Endangered Species Act tools such as conference reports, an opinion, biological opinion, safe harbor agreements. So even after the contract would end, let's say under EQIP, and that contract for whatever conservation practice that they employed on their land concludes after 5 years, regulatory predictability can still be given to that producer for up to 30 years if they maintain those practices. So that's where that partnership still comes in with FSA, NRCS, is that they're going out there and they're assessing that these actions are still being taken place, or the actions that took place, the practices that were employed, are still viable and benefiting the species. So where are we with Working Lands for Wildlife? So here's a good snapshot of the various locations on the national scale for the Working Lands for Wildlife program. But as you'll see and read, if you go to their website, it's now, instead of from a national office lens, it's now from a state-to-state lens. And so you'll have, for example, the pink in the southeast is the gopher tortoise, but we're starting to dial more and more in at the local level. I know, for example, Colorado proposed one for a trout species that only exists high in the Rocky Mountains. And so the states are taking the reins and meeting the Working Lands for Wildlife criteria, and by doing that, they're getting that stamp of approval from this initiative program. Even though it's not looked at it that way, it's still just a means with which these states can now do good things and be recognized for the species protection that they're employing, and again, partnering with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get that regulatory predictability where we can provide that. And so you might have noticed, I'll backspace real quick, you'll notice the monarch butterfly area there from Texas up to Minnesota and over to Ohio. And that was through direct work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where we were working with our NRCS partners to identify critical monarch butterfly habitat and identifying practices that could be employed by producers to enhance and protect the monarch butterfly. And where that map on your right there derived from is from what we see here as we call it the heat map. And so what that shows, the darker the red, the more significant the monarch habitat is, and all those dots identify coastal program and Partners for Fish and Wildlife programs for where we were on the ground employing conservation practices for the benefit of monarch and other species. And then if you look to your left there, that's where we're working with USDA, and that heat map really blends nicely with what NRCS monarch butterfly habitat emphasis area has been identified. So again, ways with which we're collaborating with our USDA partners to maximize benefits offered by the Farm Bill conservation programs. And here's a more recent example. One that is from Working Lands for Wildlife 2.0. I mentioned the state programs. And here we have the Kenai Peninsula identified as an area of concern because it's one of these areas that are fished heavily, and it's a resource that's loved to pieces. And as a result, the spawning habitat for the various salmon species that use the Kenai watershed and the Kenai Peninsula are coming under threat. So if you look there on the bottom corner of the Kenai map, and you see all those little blue squiggly lines, those are the streams and the watershed of the Kenai Peninsula. And most of those in the middle of the peninsula reside within a national wildlife refuge, the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. But those areas that you see connect with the ocean are on private lands. So this is an opportunity to partner not only with NRCS, but all the other entities identified in that Kenai's Mountain to Sea partnership to work together, to protect the riparian zone, so that really ties in nicely with the Restore America's Estuaries Living Shoreline initiative, because that's exactly what we're working on up there, is to maintain a living shoreline and protect the shoreline from being trampled to where the habitat goes away. But also, you don't think of that area of Alaska as being significant in ag production, but there is some agriculture production up there, and so working with those producers to limit any potential runoff or problems that we could foresee in these pristine environments. So the next phase here is, as we're continuing to work with our partners with FSA and NRCS and others across the landscape, is how can we have a collective voice to identify areas of the Farm Bill that we would like to see improved upon and maximize the benefit to fish and wildlife. So we're focusing primarily on various program aspects needing improvement, as I mentioned. For example, the increase of the CRP acreage cap. There's a high demand for more acres right now, and those conversations have been going on in Congress. I believe Representative Peterson out of Minnesota suggested a 40 million acre cap to bring it back up to historic levels. But that involves a significant amount of funding to reach that. So we would like to see it increase. The reality is it probably may not be increased to that 40 million level, but no wholesale changes that we're looking at in our conversations with partners for Farm Bill conservation programs, but more tweaks here and there to maximize benefits. And when we're messaging across the board, we want to coordinate that messaging with our conservation partners, and so all voices are heard equally, and we're doing our best not to be at cross purposes when we're talking about what it is we would like to improve upon in the Farm Bill. And so, what are ways with which all of us out there can participate and help? Well, there's state technical committees. If you haven't had a conversation with your local NRCS or FSA office, it would be a good opportunity to talk with them. And because what these technical committees do is that they review the operations and make decisions on how these programs can apply locally. Again, it's locally driven. Those programs that have great success are because of the success and the drive of the local office and those supporting the local office that is requesting that these programs be employed across the landscape in their area. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is at the table, as well as other partners, to make these recommendations up to the state conservationists to improve benefits where we can. And as I mentioned earlier, there's county level discussions and conversations that are going on all the time. And so that is a great place to start, is to go into those county offices and identify ways with which we can make improvements and tweak things here and there, but all through the lens of working together and partnership and trying to maximize the benefits and helping where we can. And then there's, you know, opportunities there that, you know, there's we just don't know. We don't know what we don't know, but we need to get those conversations going so we can recognize where opportunities do exist. So with that, I'll leave you my contact information as well as my supervisor, Dave Walker, who's the Farm Conservation Programs Coordinator. Again, there's only 2 of us in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service whose full-time job is to pay attention to the Farm Bill and the conservation programs offered wherein, and do our best to maximize the benefits for fish and wildlife across the country. And it's a big challenge, but with great partners like Restore America's Estuaries, the challenge doesn't seem so daunting when we share that common voice. So with that, Lee, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ed. That was really helpful. You gave a great overview, so thank you for that. We do have a couple questions, so let me switch. I'm gonna take the screen back, so just as a note to participants, if you want to jot down Dave Walker's information, when I take the screen back, I'll have Ed's information up, but I won't have Dave's. So I'll leave this up for just a quick minute while I'm asking the first question, and then I'll take control back of the screen. So we have just a few questions, Ed. The first one I think would just be of benefit for everybody to hear. But we had somebody ask about the reauthorization intervals of the Farm Bill. So can you kind of talk about how often it gets reauthorized? Sure. Yeah, it's every 5 years. It's the start of the fiscal year to the end of the fiscal year. So every 5 years is when we look at reauthorizing the Farm Bill. Great. Thank you. And then we have another question that reads, what are the main programs that favor lands, e.g. private ranches, that have been identified as critical for habitat connectivity? For example, if a local authority established zoning based on corridors, could ranchers whose lands fall under the corridor benefit from financial support to implement new zoning regulations, e.g. wildlife-friendly fencing? Right. So there's a couple programs that could be explored for that. You know, 'cause when you said ranching, the first thing that came to my mind is CRP grasslands, because it is a working lands program that allows grazing, and so those areas that can be employed and put into that program could be used as connectivity for sure across the landscape. The only limitation there, as we talked about earlier, is the 2 million acre cap, which is a part of that 24 million acre cap, which currently resides in the 2014 Farm Bill. So if that can get elevated and increase, then it would increase those opportunities as well. But there's also, you know, maybe areas for easements if you have willing landowners who wish to sell property. Then there's also the easement programs that could possibly come into play there as well. Great, thank you. And then I have a couple other questions are coming in, so this is great. Keep sending those in, guys. We'll get to as many as we can. So this one comes from a colleague down in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. Some states have oyster restoration and/or aquaculture programs developed through the NRCS EQIP. Can Ed talk a bit more about those specific programs within EQIP and also explain how we could go about creating the same in, for example, North Carolina? What is the process?
Yeah, that's a great question about aquaculture, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, I'll have to do more research on it instead of speculate. We can talk offline. You have my contact information, and that'd be something I'd be happy to pursue for you.
Fantastic. Okay, so we have a couple more. Let's see. So we have an RCPP question.
Okay.
Can Deepwater Horizon funds be used as a match for RCPP federal funding for easement acquisition?
That's a good question. So if I'm not mistaken, Deepwater Horizon dollars is basically the payout from British Petroleum for the oil spill. And so can the dollars that British Petroleum is giving the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, if I'm trying to interpret their question, can the money that's given to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from the BP Horizon skill be used as a match for RCPP? And the answer would be, on the surface, no. It would have to be a contribution to the overall effort. So if the state or the entity was trying to use, let's say, PR dollars to maximize the money being used on the ground, the BP Horizon dollars given to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service could be used as a contribution, but not as a direct cost share match.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying that. All right, we have another question about ESA predictability. Can you elaborate on this subject and describe how it is applied on the ground for a petitioned or candidate species, e.g. the gopher tortoise, WLFW?
Sure. Great question for Working Lands for Wildlife. So the premise is that let's say you have a forest landowner who is wanting to thin and burn longleaf stands in the southeast, but would like to have that regulatory predictability with respect to incidental take of the species if they perform these actions and are receiving federal dollars to help perform those actions. So what it is through the consultation process, you have identified practices that are allowed through Section 7 that say, okay, you can do X, Y, and Z because those are considered approved for the conservation of the, what it is the working land's trying to do, but also it can benefit the species itself. So if these landowners employ whatever those approved practices are as identified through that consultation process, then the regulatory predictability comes in, because if they are doing what it is that they said that they were going to do and it's in line with the consultation, then they'll have that assurance that if there is take, that there isn't going to be a ramification for them because it's from the incidental lens, because they are doing what's already been approved as conservation practices in the consultation.
Great. All right, one last question for you before we hop off. I know we're bumping up right at 2, but we'll get this one last question in. In the Conservation Stewardship Program, what determines the species of wildlife that enhancement activities can be done for? So that would be at the local, again, that state level. That's where the states really take over, and they identify what it is that they feel those enhancements for example, as you identify the animal enhancements, specifically the species that they were wanting to target. So that's not on a national scale lens that's provided. That is on a state-by-state basis. So if you haven't had that conversation with your local NRCS or FSA office, specifically for CSP and NRCS, then yeah, definitely do that. And if there's something that's not identified that you feel would be benefited if it was included in the animal enhancements, then have that conversation. Great. All right, one more question popped in. Hopefully this won't be a long question. How are specialty crops determined?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? How
are specialty crops determined?
So can Can the person explain that a little bit more?
If the person who asked that question wants to elaborate, I'll leave it open just for a minute. Otherwise, Ed's email is there on the screen. So the asker of that question might just need to follow up.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. And okay. By all means, whoever, if there's more questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And if I don't have the answer for you, I will track it down and get back to you to provide you the right direction for it.
Great. All right. Well, with that, want to be respectful of everybody's time. So thank you all so much for joining. And Ed, thank you so much for giving us that perspective on the Farm Bill and all of the opportunities to take advantage of the programs contained within that bill. It was really helpful. Hopefully folks learned a lot. And again, Ed's contact information is up there on the screen, so feel free to reach out to him. And if I can offer any assistance, again, my information is up on the screen as well. So thank you all again. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.